Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this special episode of our Illuminating Primary Care podcast. I'm joined by my colleague David today, and we're going to have a chat about the ARRS funding for newly qualified GPs. Obviously, it's a hot topic at the minute. Lots of PCNs trying to work out what they're going to do, how to utilise it. There's a lot of uncertainty, and as we know, the clock is ticking on this funding. So we thought that we would put together a little bit of a summary on just our experiences so far, and what we've learned. Being on the outside looking in and speaking with quite literally hundreds of PCNs over the last month or so to hopefully help PCNs who are trying to navigate through these quite stormy waters. So we are going to look at the actual issues with the scheme itself and probably resonate with some of the issues that yourselves, the PCNs, are probably finding, but then also look at how we can help, as I say, navigate through that and how our service can be of benefit. So if we look at the issues within the scheme, the first one is obviously how limited it is in terms of who is eligible, isn't it, David? And there was a lot of uncertainty around who's going to qualify and who won't. There's a time limit in place, and we're seeing a lot of FAQs flying around as well from individual ICBs and federations on what's going to constitute, an applicable GP for this scheme. And there's uncertainty as well around GPs who have maybe been working but not in a substantive fashion. So if they've been doing things like maternity covers, again, it falls into these grey areas. So I think now we're finding more and more that we understand what these eligibility criteria are, and we can help talk you through them in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the other big factors as well has been, I guess, really arbitrary rules around the maximum reimbursable amount for the GPs in the roles. So once you've jumped through the first hurdle of who's eligible, when you actually get to looking at how much PCNs can afford to pay them, it's not necessarily the amount of funding that's causing the problem. It's a bottleneck around what is the maximum reimbursable amount, which PCN managers are probably familiar with in relation to the other roles that they've got in the PCNs. Where the GP position is maybe a bit unique is that the maximum reimbursable amount is disproportionately low compared to other market rates. So whereas with pharmacists and some of the other positions in PCN where you've got that maximum reimbursable amount, it's sort of loosely aligned with what they're being paid in primary care anyway. Whereas with the GPs, when you break down the hourly rate into a sessional rate, you're looking at the bottom end of the BMA recommended salary, which nobody's paid since 2016, 17. So yeah, it's really not in line with that, and I think that's going to be a big problem that a lot of
the
PCNs
problem
are trying
that
to deal with.
they're facing is, I think, in some ways the government's looked at it in the wrong way. You use that example of a pharmacist, and let's say it's, I don't know, a banded role, and there's a bracket of say 53 to 58, whatever it is, it sits within that. It's not a huge bracket, and you can go up to the maximum, but in this case, the maximum is the minimum. So it is the minimum BMA recommended salary. And as you say, there are not many GPs, if any, that are currently working on 8,123 a session or whatever it is. And PCNs have therefore got four options. They can look at paying the minimum rate and rolling the dice on hopefully a GP will be interested in taking that post. They can supplement it themselves. A lot of PCNs and practices aren't going to have the money to do that, especially with these roles being supernumerary. They can speak to their ICB and try and get sign off on paying a higher sessional rate in return for maybe less hours, because obviously that 92k cap is still going to be in place, or they can get creative with the session lengths. So again, this is what makes it so unclear, is there is not one approach, and there are different ways that you can tackle this. But you're absolutely right, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty around how many sessions or hours the PCN can claim as well, because again, it's mostly based on a 4.16 hour session length, but not many practices work to that. Their sessions might be 4 hours 30, 4 hours 40, 4 hours dead, and then I think extrapolating that into a working pattern that sits within their existing GPs, which I think it needs to. You need to make this as as close a role to the existing
Yeah.
salary GPs within the practices as possible, so that the transition, we have to remember that
Yeah.
in almost all these cases, these are going to be newly qualified GPs that are coming straight out the VTS. They're going to need some sort of platform to come in and be supported. So it needs to be a role that mirrors what their peers are doing. But if there's a discrepancy around the session lengths, that just creates a whole other amount of confusion.
Yeah, I think another issue with that, especially though, is that when you look at the DES framework and the way the funding is allocated, there's a lot of
Yeah,
confusion around the annualized figures, or what is an annualized figure versus
yeah,
what is a prorated figure. So actually, from having spoken to dozens of PCM managers now, I'd say probably 50% are probably
more.
underestimating the amount of hours they can
Yeah,
claim by 50%. Immediately they're kind of halving what they think they can spend because they're basing it on what they think are annualized figures, whereas
yeah.
actually it's not the case. But that's not necessarily clearly outlined. And again, that goes all the way up to the ICBs, where people are interpreting things differently in terms of what they're actually approving
Yeah,
for
and
practices,
and
which
even
makes it a bit
where
of a minefield.
there are references to it in the DES, it might be a one line, semi vaguely worded reference
Mm,
in a 1,000-line DES, and that's the only clarity. And it's so
yeah,
easy to go snowblind when you're trying to plow through these frameworks. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the confusion around annualizing it, prorating it, but also the fact that you have the same amount of funding available to you regardless of when you start using it. So I've spoken with many a PCN. Let's say they've got £50,000 of funding. They are saying, right, well, we're into November now, so we've worked out that we've actually only got about 40. We're like, no, no, no. You have that whole amount available to you. If you don't start spending it until the 1st of March, you
yeah,
still have £50,000 to spend. So yeah, I think there's been a real lack of concise communication, and it's not great when, certainly in my
yeah.
experience, probably 80% of the PCNs I've spoken with have got it wrong in some way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But I also think there's not necessarily a real motivation to get behind it, because actually
Yeah,
there's a bit of
yeah,
ambiguity over how long the scheme's going to last anyway. So obviously they've announced it and they've ring fenced it up until the 31st of March. Um, but I think a lot of practices are really unsure what it's going to look like next year. Is it going to be the same level of funding again for 12 months? Is it going to be double, so that the current funding is representative of a 6-month period? It's really unclear. If it is extended at all. Obviously, we've been given some assurances
yeah.
that it will be extended, but we don't actually know what that's gonna look like. So it's a lot of
Yeah,
a
and
lot of
I
uncertainty
think
for sure.
the health secretary coming out in a press conference and saying that the funding will continue is great, and that's reassuring to a certain degree. But when you
Mm,
consider that the announcement was made on this first 6 months of funding in something like August, and we knew it was going live on the 1st of
yeah,
October, and it was something like the 26th of September that the information came through, it stands to reason that it very well could be the 26th of
yeah,
March before they're getting clarity on funding from 1st of April, and it's
yeah.
just nigh on impossible to plan beyond that point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think all of this kind of combined, and you've probably experienced this as well, Matt. Um, it's making PCNs really reticent to actually make decisions or kind of motivate PCNs to do something with the funding they've got available.
Yeah,
There are so many hurdles, whether it be actually the funding itself, getting PCNs
yeah,
to agree on what they're actually going to be doing. um, you know, just through to
yeah,
them agreeing this is what the GP will get used for, um, and the kind of consequence of that is that there are a lot of PCNs I'm speaking to who are going, but we can't decide how
yeah,
to use it, which is really frustrating
yeah,
because it's kind of use it or lose it. If they don't spend, or if there's a massive amount of underspend, when they come to reviewing the figures for the next financial year, there's a very high likelihood they'll fund it at a lower level because there's not been the take up that they anticipated, or the take up that the practices were telling
yeah.
people that there would be. So yeah, that's a big one for me. Is just regardless of whether you're using um, someone
Just
like
use it.
ourselves to fill it, just
Just use it.
at least use
I
it.
think the
Use
government's
it.
overestimated the cohesiveness of a lot of PCNs, and some PCNs,
Yeah.
are very collaborative, and others not, others less so. Others, I'm speaking to them and they're saying, well, we've never worked together in terms of our funding. We just portion out our funding for ours roles available, and we all do our own thing. If that's the case within your PCN, please just do it again. It might mean that you're only getting 3 sessions a week, 2-3 sessions a week, but use it, because this is going to directly impact the decisions that the policymakers and the health secretary make with regards to funding for 25-26. Because if he's given you £82 million and you've only spent £40 million of it, and yet GP leaders are going to the government and saying, we need help, they're going to clap back and say, well, we gave you the help and you didn't use it. So please, we implore you to use the funding in any way you can.
Yeah, I think the big thing is just kind of trying to promote some joined up thinking when it comes to kind of multiple or PCNs of multiple practices, because that's where it seems to get confusing or more prohibitive, I think, especially if you've got one PCN with 5-6 PCN practices. There needs to be that kind of like joined up approach, big picture thinking around what this person can actually do. And I think just to add to that as well, there's a lot of speculation at the moment that there isn't going to be that kind of winter pressures funding, and although I'm not sure that's been entirely confirmed, but it certainly looks as though this is in lieu of, winter pressures funding. And actually, the big conversation I've been having is, use it as your winter pressures GP. Bring someone in, add capacity in some form, because, like I say, it is that use it or lose it scenario. Which kind of, I guess, brings us nicely into what we've been doing, Matt. Just to kind of maybe talk about what services we offer, how we're supporting PCNs as well. The big thing for us is obviously we've been trying to talk to as many PCNs as possible, just to, I think, first and foremost, educate on what funding they've actually got available, how they can use the funding, how they can, tackle those issues where there are or is rather a lack of joined up thinking and kind of like collaboration in PCNs, and also kind of ways around it in terms of at least making sure that there is some some funding being used in some capacity across even some member practices is going to be better than nothing. And I guess one of the first points I'd really like to kind of sort of dip into is really what we've been doing day in and day out at the minute, speaking to PCN managers and clinical directors as well, but actually giving them a full breakdown, and actually having spent several weeks pouring through all of the guidance, the DES framework, everything, all the kind of tables of funding breakdown, the annualized figures, the 6-month figures, the lot. We've obviously spent a lot of time, putting that into a calculator to actually give practices a really visual guide on what they can claim based on their weighted patient population list, but then actually what that looks like in real terms, because it's all well and good saying you've got £75,000 to spend in this period of time, or you've got this pot of money to draw down in a decreasing period of time as well, which adds to the complexity. But actually factoring in things like on costs, national insurance, pension, that taking that out, what does that leave us with, and actually what does that translate into in terms of sessional rates or hourly rates, but that have to fall in line with the maximum reimbursable amount. So it's really complicated, and I think this is where a lot of PCNs are kind of falling at the first hurdle, really, because they're going like, I just don't understand this.
And the thing,
it doesn't make sense.
If you can't visualize it and you can't see it broken down, it's just a myriad of numbers and conjecture. And I think, what you've managed to do, you've certainly got more grey hairs than when you started with this. And that calculator you've put together is impressive. Is actually give them that visual. Where we can toggle it by the number of weeks remaining, and again, it's another point that's lost on them. Each week we get closer, the number of hours they can claim for goes up. So is showing them that, and I think that's something that where we're really adding value is by giving them that demonstrable example of where they sit as a PCN, and where they wouldn't necessarily have those figures available to them otherwise. And I think in line with that, it's the flexibility of our approach as well. we've seen and we've heard from
Yeah.
PCNs and clients that we're speaking to that some of the options that they're having put to them, are set for certain time periods, and they come with clauses where they have to be renewed, or they have to be made permanent. And these are all in the fine print, and effectively these traps are being set for PCNs. But what we're doing is saying, look, we're going to keep it completely flexible. It is literally month to month. You are not tied into us any longer than you are tied into the GP. It allows you to cancel anytime. Particularly, if we get to March and then you want to take a different approach in April, even with the funding, if you want to go down a different avenue, you're not tied into the provision from Menlo Park any further than that. So that, month's notice, whatever it is that you agree with the GP on their contract, we work to the same.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out as well, obviously, we're working on this in a very similar model to how we work on our substantive roles. So everything is very much on the basis of proactive recruitment projects. And, one of the sort of amazing resources we have, which we know for a fact isn't available out there with competitors, is the fact that we've got the largest network of newly qualified GPs that we build on year, and just across 23 to 24, there's over 3,000 newly qualified GPs who, that's not to say we've got 3,000 within a commutable radius of the roles we're trying to fill, but that's national coverage. And actually, just from things like staying in touch with people, regular networking, we can identify where those people are likely going to be in 6 months, what sort of things they're going to be looking for, are they relocating, what kind of practices are they interested in, and it places us really well to actually go through the PCN positions or the substantive salaried roles with these people, and really engage them in the opportunities that we're representing, which is far more effective than just relying
that
on
part
an advert.
is absolutely key, and I think it's so easy to overlook the importance of reach. I think because of the let's call it what it is. It's an unrivaled reach that we have, given that the breadth of our network. If you just look at the base numbers, so there was 1,000 full-time equivalent roles supposedly created by this funding. Very few GPs work full-time anymore. We know that. So in reality, you're probably looking more like 1,600 vacancies have actually been created by the 1,000 full-time equivalent positions that are funded. Now, within that, so if you think, okay, well, that's 1,600 GPs that need to be found to fill these vacancies. Are there 1,600 newly qualified GPs, or at least GPs who are still applicable for this funding, looking for jobs? Probably not. So the likelihood is quite a few of these roles are going to go unfilled, and therefore you are competing with other PCNs looking to do the same thing as you for an ever dwindling pool of candidates, because each one of these roles gets filled, it's one less candidates available to you. So the biggest advantage that you can have as a PCN is ensuring that you have the biggest reach. You can target as many of these applicable candidates as possible. If you just put an advert out, your advert is sat there with 10 other adverts from PCNs in your area and is competing against all of them. Whereas if you work with Menlo Park, you get access to that bigger pool of candidates that you cannot target otherwise.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's just about effectively making it as attractive as possible and being as proactive as possible.
So, and then coming back to kind of some of the other options that we've heard being put out there. So one of the ones that can understandably maybe look attractive on the face of it is the outsourcer model. So an agency, potentially a locum agency, saying, look, we're going to actually employ the GP, we'll take care of everything, and it all sits within your budget. You don't have to do a thing. And that on the face of it, as I say, might look attractive to a PCN manager who thinks, great, I just want this to be simple. The problem that you have is then you have no control over the hiring process. You're not employing that GP. The locum agency is. They choose who that they provide for you. It might not even be a face-to-face GP. The coverage in the DARES allows for remote GPs, so there's nothing preventing them. If you've agreed to that service contract, there's nothing stopping that provider saying, look, we've got a remote GP for you to start on Monday. You don't know who that GPs, you don't know where they are, whether they know your referral pathways, whether they know your systems. I think with our model, because we are doing an introductory service as opposed to an employment and outsourcing service, you control it. You hire the GP, you interview them, you employ them. And it also means that you can then set their working terms, how many patients they're going to see. Again, this would all be set for you going down an outsourcer model where you do not control the GP or you do not employ them. Keep in mind that the control element is really important if you want a more vested say in how this GP works. But in addition to that, it's the actual time involved as well. So I think that's where, when you're looking at a ticking clock like this is, and again, each week we get closer, the number of hours that you can recruit into goes up, but it also decreases the likelihood of you using them all because you've got more of them to fill. And these GPs are going to become hard to find very quickly. Is you want to ensure that you've cut down your time to hire as soon as possible. And I think that links in with our reach. We can find you more people in a quicker time period than others, and that's going to have GPs in post sooner. And that's ultimately what we need. If you're going to use the funding to the best of your ability, you need a GP in post yesterday.
Yeah, definitely. Just linking back to what you were talking about, Matt, as well with the outsourcing model. I think one of the biggest concerns I've got with that, aside, well, there are a lot of concerns I've got with that, but one of the ones that I think is probably going to have the most impact day to day, in an ideal world, if you did get a GP through that outsourcing model, one of the big problems, I've identified, and I think a lot of CDs agree with me on this, is if you're going to use them in like a hub setting where they're in one practice, but seeing patients across multiple surgeries, it just creates a massive disparity between the salary GPs that are already employed and the ARRS GPs, which is absolutely not what you want to do. I think it sort of devalues the GP model itself. I think the best thing and kind of the most progressive thing I think practices can do is try and incorporate this GP in a way that is aligned with what their other doctors are doing. Because ultimately that person might want to stay longer term. It might lead to a really good relationship with that GP who does stay with you on a salaried basis if and when the ARRS funding comes to an end. So I think it's just kind of looking at it in, like I say, that kind of like joined up thinking, bigger picture approach where you're trying to standardize it with what else is going on in the surgery and kind of setting up, that GP based on your own terms rather than somebody else's. Because what you don't want to do is for your existing salary GPs to go, okay, well, that GP is doing this. Why can't I do that? And if that's not in your remit or that's not in your control, then you're going to have issues, and it's going to probably breed resentment with, your wider salary team. And I think that's one of the benefits of kind of a direct engagement model where, we are introducing these people, they're employed within the PCN. But one of the things that I know PCNs are nervous about is liability, and kind of ongoing liability. And that kind of probably brings us to the last of, the big points that I think we want to make is we're really encouraging and we're supporting PCNs in employing people on fixed term contracts and actually talking them through what that involves, how you structure that, and what the job plan is going to look like. The job plan should effectively be the same, but actually the contract and the length of contract is on a fixed term basis, which is really important just for kind of minimizing liability for the PCNs, and just kind of gives you a level of protection, should the funding not be extended or should the funding or the terms of the funding change come, the 31st of March. And I think that's one of the big things that for some reason a lot of PCNs have kind of overlooked. That there are, for obvious reasons, concerns about, redundancy costs and things like that, whereas there are ways of mitigating it while still kind of, having full control over the process, who you hire, what they're doing. And obviously we're sort of well positioned to chat through what that looks like, how you can do it, what the session structures can look like, etc. Which I think is a really important point.
Hopefully this has been useful for CDs and managers, and even just potentially GPs as well, who are looking for these jobs themselves, just to understand things on the other side of the fence a little bit and what the PCNs are going through trying to put these roles together. So yeah, hopefully it's been useful. If anyone wants to speak about this further with us and either utilize our calculator and have us demonstrate to you what your funding is going to look like, and then discuss in a little bit more detail how our introductory service works and how we can ensure you've got a GP in post as close to yesterday as we can get in touch with us today.